Well, welcome everybody. Happy to see you here today. I am going to start with the same old boring piece that this is an extinction event, something unprecedented in the history of mankind. So we spent several million years as hunter-gatherers, hundreds of thousands of years of agriculturalists and settlers, a couple of centuries, a couple of hundred years in the industrial age, and now in decades, we've been in the information age, and we're just entering into the age that they are calling cognitive augmentation. In fact, Nick, I think that's one of your phrases, isn't it? Cognitive augmentation, where machines are going to be giving us ideas on what we ought to be doing. And it's the first time a tool has ever been made that doesn't require us to use the tool. So you think of a chisel, it needs a hammer and a human. Now you're going to have this little machine giving you all kinds of generative ideas. Brand new phenomenon, increasing in intensity, according to Mr. Darvo Garno. Often tools are improving at 100% every 3.5 months. Amazing stuff. This guy, Ray Kurzweil's been on this account for decades, and that's a graph that shows the price performance of computation. Down on the far left-hand side, World War II, breaking of the code, the cost of that per computation up to today, where we get 100 trillion computations for every dollar. So amazing. And he says, too, that these tools are improving at 100% every 3.5 months. So when I think about it, for businesses for sure, this new generative augmentation is an extinction event. If you don't get started on this journey, which is why we're having these webcasts, if you don't get started, there's only one question left to answer, and that's where do you want to be buried? So, according to this gentleman, formerly Google's chief evangelist, we have a whole bunch of stuff that has to get dealt with immediately. And today we have the CEO and founder of NuEnergy. And that gentleman, Niraj Bhargava, has a long history in this industry and is the man who will tell us that if you as a director are fearful, oh yeah, there are lots of good things that could happen with generative AI, but I hear all the nasty things that could happen. This is Niraj's exact business, to give you a dashboard as a director or chair of the board or CEO, to give you a dashboard of your ability to avoid the downsides. I think we've called them guardrails here, Niraj, but that's essentially what it does. These tools that Niraj is going to talk to us about today are tools to help you overcome the fear of moving into this field. And we both think that that's absolutely vital components of making yourself a candidate for survival in the new world. So Niraj from NuEnergy, welcome to our cohorts. And please, I'll turn it over to you. And thank you so much for being with us. Niraj.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Nick, for inviting me to join you. And I'm delighted to be here. And I think, yeah, David, you set the table well for our talk today. I look forward to the conversation. I assume, David, you can see my screen okay?
Yep, I'm fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
So
Yep.
I think your opening slides said it even better. I think it's very clear to all of us that the world is being disrupted with this tsunami on AI. This Economist article or cover, I think, kind of summarizes it in a simple way that AI is a big headline and it's a huge opportunity with the angel halo, but it's also the devil in disguise, and there's a lot of fears rightfully out there as well. So clearly a topic for today, and one that where I would like to come, as you said, David, from an oversight point of view, is that AI can be trusted, but it requires very solid governance. And so we are all participating on some boards, and boards and governors need to take action on the strategy opportunity, as you point out, but also the risks and your risk register. And we really do need to look at both sides of that equation. So with that, I'm just going to open up with a few comments, and I look forward to the questions, David and Nick. But I do talk about risks. I care about the risks and making sure we monitor the risks. But I think the biggest risk, as you said, is not using it. And if we don't, someone else will. So the extinction event is multiple facets here about the risks of AI, and one is just not moving fast enough to engage with it. But when we talk about trusting AI and making sure that we do have guardrails and oversight, and really can trust the technology, a question I'll raise is, who do we need to trust? Is it trusting the technology? Is it trusting the developer of the technology? Is it trusting the governors or the government to have oversight? Or is it the user that we need to make sure is using this technology effectively for all the tremendous opportunity it provides, but also the oversight and the trust questions that do come up? When we talk about the tsunami and all of the activity going on, there's a lot of great private sector firms that are developing AI, a lot of organizations, public sector developing their own AI. But this quote came from the AI Safety Summit a few months ago in the UK, where the former Prime Minister of the UK said, you know, AI firms are biased as well, and they cannot mark their own homework. There's obviously a lot of terrific technology coming to bear, and rightfully, we want to hear about it. We want to see the marketing message and the demos, but we also want to make sure that there's some oversight. Boards have that role. Third-party reviewers can have that role, but we need to make sure that we do have the checks and balances around the AI activity. I think the title on this podcast is an old business school adage we're familiar with, but it absolutely applies to AI. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So there is a tremendous wave of opportunity heading active right now. We want to engage, but we want to be thoughtful and manage it effectively, and that includes measurements. So happy to dive deeper onto the topic about measuring AI in today's talk. Also, the metaphor of guardrails. You know, in this case, and I've done work with Transport Canada and other organizations where, you know, you don't have to think too hard on this one, that you don't need to wait for the first car accident to realize that your highway should have guardrails. And the AI superhighway absolutely needs guardrails. We can't prevent any accidents, but we certainly can do our fiduciary responsibility of making sure that we're not only going down that highway, but we're putting the guardrails up alongside. AI safety, you know, there is a lot of talk about the fears and the risks, and there's multiple layers. People talk about the geopolitical and the existential risks and the long term, but there are short-term risks and long-term risks. So I like this adage that just, you know, when we think about the long term, it really is a series of short terms, both in the opportunity and the risk side. So let's make sure that we act now and think about the short-term implications of what we're doing that can lead us to the better long term that we're aiming for. And then I'm sure you've heard this as well, but as somebody who does instructions and executive education on AI and AI governance, we certainly hear a lot of people saying, but I'm not an expert. You know, I've got lots to learn. And I think we've learned over the last year that even the experts have a lot to learn. And this is a moving target. But on the flip side, we are all experts. We have human intelligence. We're now leveraging artificial intelligence, and we can be smart on how we use it and how we use it effectively. So I encourage everybody to not apologize for not being an AI expert, because we can be, and we are in our own way. So overall message is that I do believe AI can be trusted, but it's not a given. We do need to act on how and when we trust our AI technology to move the yardsticks in our mandate. So as you introduced me, David, I am a co-founder and CEO of a terrific team of experts in both technology and governance at NuEnergy.ai. We're headquartered in Ottawa, but we're spread across Canada and working internationally now. Our organization is fully focused on building trust in AI technologies through practical governance frameworks, ongoing education, and transparent metrics with guardrails right through the AI lifecycle. And that's an important point as well, is that the checks and balances of this technology is not a one-time go, no-go question. AI is dynamic. We need to consider guardrails all along the AI journey. So NuEnergy.ai has a software platform called the Machine Trust Platform. We've gone through some rigorous testing with the Government of Canada and graduated out of the Innovation Solutions Canada program with some significant testing, and now commercially available in the Government of Canada and commercially available to organizations to provide guardrails and metrics. We consider ourselves an independent third-party reviewer. So we're not building AI that we're saying is trustworthy. We're a third-party reviewer of the AI activity at NuEnergy.ai. So our platform, in brief, is a software platform that has 4 major modules: a learning platform for education, an organizational readiness module for policy generation and frameworks, because again, you'll be surprised how many organizations don't yet have a policy on their use of AI. And we need to make sure that we build our readiness in the organization. And we have a couple of modules for generative and traditional AI that develop guardrails and monitors the AI activity. At the heart of our platform is what we call our Machine Trust Index, which I'll explain a little bit further, is a way to quantify a trust score of the AI activity and really manage that portfolio into, as you mentioned earlier, a dashboard. So board members and others can understand what's going on in your organization. And the simple dashboard is red, yellow, green. What is the AI activity that's clearly within acceptable guardrails of your organization? So let's get on with it. What are clearly the ones that are outside of what's acceptable to our stakeholders in our organization in the red zone? And the many use cases that are in the yellow, proceed with caution. Yes, we can proceed in certain circumstances, but we need to monitor how it's used and how it drifts over time. So our software platform is all about that dashboard and index and capability. But let me start with a use case example. I mentioned that we don't need to wait for the first car accident. Well, we've already had some car accidents in the use of AI, and we can learn from those. So one that many of us are aware of is the example of facial recognition technology. And so advancements in neural nets and deep learning over the years allowed us to be able to look at faces, look at pictures, look at the internet, look at Facebook data, and identify individuals through facial recognition technology. And that technology had many breakthroughs and many opportunities for application. But this slide kind of summarizes some historical data. I share that this data may be out of date, but there is a recognition that when you measure the performance of that facial recognition technology, it actually had a different performance level for people, for males and females, and people that are Caucasians or visible minorities. So clearly some data that might be relevant to your stakeholders. And in the case of facial recognition, the privacy commissioner, the previous privacy commissioner actually outlawed the use of facial recognition technology in Canada. And that wake-up call, in the case of Clearview AI being the technology provider to law enforcement, actually helped cause concerns around public trust. And the law enforcement industry had a wake-up call because public trust matters a lot to many of our industries and certainly in law enforcement. But I use this 4-quadrant slide when I look at use cases to illustrate what's happening around us in this AI tsunami. And what we really would propose as best practices is that when you see the opportunity for AI in the data that we're collecting, and in the case of facial recognition, the tremendous amount of data on the internet and Facebook and other places, there was a recognition that we can use that data to create algorithms and models to be able to detect faces and provide a solution in the case of law enforcement to detect criminals, find pedophiles and terrorists, and speed up arrests. And so clearly, this is an attractive technology opportunity when you have a mandate like law enforcement. But what we would suggest is rather than going from the opportunity to the solution and deployment, let's pause as governors and make sure we ask good questions. And we know in the school of good governance, board members need to ask good questions. So what were the questions that were asked before facial recognition technology was deployed? Or did we take the moment to govern and ask the good questions? Is it biased? Are there some privacy concerns? How are we using this technology? And had we asked those questions in hindsight, maybe we would have had a better solution and had governance value where we actually can monitor the usage and use it effectively to speed up arrests and prevent crimes. So that's a use case example. But in today's world, clearly generative AI has changed the landscape completely. And there's many different use cases and uses of AI today. And whether it's OpenAI or Copilot or the many different applications. So again, using that same illustration, there's a huge opportunity on conversational intelligence and the data and text that exists on the internet. And so we can go ahead and create a solution to summarize examples and looking at the data and create text and data that can be made very helpful for our mandates. but have we asked the questions in parallel to deploying generative AI and asking questions that we know are fears that we talked about earlier and that do exist for good reason about privacy of the data, confidentiality violations, biases, and hallucinations? Is this really accurate? And does that matter to our stakeholders? In many cases, of course, it does. So our message is let's deploy the AI, but let's ask the questions and put the guardrails up so we're getting the value out of these technologies. So my key message, David and Nick, is really as governors, as oversight, we need to ask good questions, and then we need to measure, monitor, and mitigate those risks so we can get the best out of the technology. But when we talk about governance, compliance matters. Legislation is always lagging, and there's a checkerboard of legislation around the world. Compliance is not enough. When we talk about governance, it's not just are we meeting legislative requirements, but are we asking good questions in the eyes of the stakeholder? Are we asking questions that are applicable to our organization, whether we're a hospital or a bank or a government department or a tech company? Are we asking questions relevant to the area of marketing or whatever functional area we're in? And are we asking questions relevant to the use case or the user as well? And we need to ask good questions, but it is a complex topic. And not only do we have to ask good questions about the use cases and the uses, but it's multidimensional. It may vary depending on where you are in the life cycle. Are you at the data collection stage? Are you at the deployment? And is it high impact use case or low impact? We don't want to over bureaucratize our organization on every use case, but if it is high impact, we may need to ask different questions than if it's low. And is it transparent? Is it a black box or white box? So we think that we need to ask good questions depending on the context, measure, monitor, and mitigate. So what NuEnergy has brought to the game in this AI governance area is creating a trust index. So why can't we utilize some measurements and aggregate those measurements into quantitative trust score? And we can, and NuEnergy has patents on a methodology for this, but really it's an aggregation of those good questions and metrics into a score on a 0 to 100 scale that we not only measure and create a score, but we measure it over time. And we determine what is considered acceptable and put it into the right areas of the dashboard. So NuEnergy.ai has a technology called the Machine Trust Index to help governors and oversight quantify the trustworthiness of the AI so we can move forward with confidence. When we talk about asking good questions, let me start with an illustration. AI trust, AI governance, there's many topics here. So we've identified at NuEnergy a starting set of standard categories and questions. So from bias to ethics to transparency, security, performance, compliance, these are all important categories, but it may vary. So it may not be one size fits all, but we do have a standard set of categories and a standard set of questions that we start with. But then we work with our clients to understand what are the right questions for your organization. I mentioned as well that this is a multidimensional topic of asking good questions. And clearly, in the dynamic nature of AI, from a governance point of view, I've simplified it into data, development, deployment, drift. But yeah, across the life cycle, the questions may vary, and we need to monitor it. And I do emphasize the drift categories that we need to monitor it over time and track the trustworthiness. I also mentioned there's a question about transparency. And the reality of the AI activity is that a lot of it is black boxes. And we need a certain level of transparency from the developer on how it's being used and how it's tested and what's been done. So a simple illustration here of opaqueness or transparency. Do we have access? But what we've learned at NuEnergy is even black boxes have to be assessed. And there are methods to do that for black boxes or gray boxes or white boxes. How much transparency may vary the questions and the kind of metrics we can apply. So ultimately, we're talking about guardrails for AI and having tools, policies, processes that can be fitted and measure the trustworthiness in the eyes of the stakeholder. If it's the public you're serving, if it's customers, if it's shareholders, if it's employees, different questions may apply. and we need to apply those measurements as guardrails and understand when we're veering off that superhighway. So again, our platform at New Energy is an illustration of what can be done to put those guardrails on AI and onboard education, policy development, and measurements alongside. So that's my overview, David and Nick, and happy to take questions. But message is AI can be trusted.
Can you go back one slide, please, Niraj?
For sure.
And if you take that circle there with 84.1 in it, we saw it last time and we saw it with a run chart. So I'm the chairman of board ABC Co. And you give me this thing. Is 84.1 good, or what? How does that actually read to me, or how do you explain the different categories to me? Are we okay, or are we in trouble?
Yeah. So that's a great question, David. And right now in New Energy's journey, we're not believing it's one size fits all. So we co-create the right measuring stick for an organization.
Yeah.
And so therefore, one of the downsides of that is that you may not have something to compare that 84 to at first blush. Just
Uh-oh.
finding the threat. So you know if the 84 is,
Okay,
David, can you hear me?
you're coming in and
Yeah,
out. I don't know
yeah,
what's
Niraj,
happening
actually, if
to
you
your
can
connection.
just dial using your phone, actually, that way I think this could be a little bit safer. You can keep going, but if you can dial on your phone on the side and then pick up the phone, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll do that right
So
now. You
the
can hear me though?
84.1 by itself, it doesn't, it tells you it's a high number out of 100. Sounds like it's okay. And it would sound to me like we are weakest in transparency because that green line on your circle is the narrowest. Would that be?
Yeah.
And then I would ask the question, well, tell me about transparency and what I should know there that we can get that up. And what might that give us as a score if we improve that?
Yeah.
And I might ask, if I were chairman of the risk committee, which parts of this quadrant causes the biggest potential damage to us? And then I
Yeah.
can report to the board on the thing down on the bottom right that we're AI governance dashboards, we're 800. We don't see any that are of catastrophic potential to us, nor even those that are somewhat damaging. We feel that we have this whole arena roped off and handrailed satisfactorily. Would that be a successful interpretation as a board chair of that piece at the bottom?
Absolutely, David. If you can hear me okay right now?
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
back on.
Okay, so yes, we in our software not only do you get that aggregate score and the red, yellow, green, but you can double click on seeing where is the number veering and where are the high scores and low scores in those categories.
I see.
And each category is broken down by question and metrics, so you can double click down to see where is the issue. But you can also focus your attention based on the aggregate score, and then you can monitor it over time to see the trend as well as compare it to others within your organization or benchmark it to other organizations as well if we have common measuring sticks.
And Niraj, it's fantastic. And in order to build this dashboard, presumably, you need a lot of data coming in from the company. So if the company's got 300 AI projects going on, from the really mundane to the much more risky. But how does the data get into the system? How do you ensure that every project, has its complies to putting the data in? Like what are the processes around this to ensure that the data is relatively accurate?
Yeah, and as you point out, there's more than one kind of data. There's the use case data, which is and we do have ways to classify use cases to generative AI, traditional AI, and within generative AI, different classes, whether they're assistants or they're large language models of your own. Quite a range. So we co-create a policy and framework for an organization on the classifications of it, and then yes, collect data. What we've learned though as well is that every use case doesn't need to be tracked. There are lower impact use cases that we want to encourage our organization to follow. And so we may track users as well as use cases as well. But we create a framework, a methodology with the client to have that flow chart of how we are going to track and triage the uses of AI and enter the data and track the data. And some of that is automated. And I'll mention we have non-technical metrics and technical metrics. So some of the technical metrics looks at the training data or the operational data of the AI. Others are using a subject matter expert kind of metrics that may apply to different topics.
And as you mentioned, a number of times the concept of high impact versus low impact. sure some of the folks on the call have heard this before, but can you explain what that means and how it's different, for example, in Canada versus the US versus, Europe?
Yeah. So first of all, as I mentioned, we are doing work with the federal government of Canada, and we've graduated out of their program. You may be aware that the Treasury Board directives exist in the government of Canada, and one of those includes the algorithm impact assessment, which is something that's available publicly as well. And we see that as a classification of impact. There's a level one, two, three, and four, and depending on the impact level, there's different mitigations recommended. So that's one way of measuring impact, but there may be different ways for different industries and organizations. On the second part of your question, Nick, about how it varies around the world, I mentioned the checkerboard. We know in Europe, as David and I were in Lisbon recently, there's a very strong legislative view on the EU AI Act, as opposed to other jurisdictions like the US or other places where it's a little bit more let's encourage innovation and not discourage that as we move forward. There's checks and balances that vary country to country, and there is questions about, is there any kind of common standards? Clearly, ISO and IEEE and others are developing standards, NIST as well. So it is a moving target as far as how different parts of the world are using it, and it varies by industry as well. So that gets back to David's question about, what do we compare to? But we believe today we have to ask those questions, measure and monitor, but it should get better and better as far as what are we measuring against.
Are there going to be eventually sort of user platforms, Niraj, so that I want to install, let's say, an inventory control program using AI because I have 1,000 items in inventory and I got 500 stores I got to stock. So there's clear advantages of being able to use something beyond the human brain to manage that. And maybe it's already been introduced by 3 other companies who have already sanitized it. Can you find that out? Can you say that user app is already sanitized? Tick. Don't worry about that as a director, David. We've been through 4 other companies. They've all worked at it, and the synthesis of their guardrails, their handrails are A, B, and C, and we put them in already. So take that one off your worry list. Is that going to happen, or is it happening?
I think both. I think there are people working on certifications and
Uh-huh.
standards and measurements. And so, on our platform, we can do some compliance measurement against standards and legislation. We are working with some of the people that we met in Europe that on standards like the United Nations is looking for some standards and others. So yeah, so certifications is something that I think will come and is coming on giving you that kind of label. But again, I come back to, though, the dynamic nature. So it's not necessarily a one-time check that you need to do.
I see. Yeah.
But I do agree that that kind of a certification is very helpful.
Yeah,
Right.
but David, like even if an app is certified, right, how you get the data to go into the app, is the data, clean? I mean, are there privacy issues? Like there's really no, I mean, you can double check Microsoft PowerPoint and it's not doing anything bad, but but now CrowdStrike is inside Microsoft PowerPoint, and next thing you know. So
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, you have to be really careful, even if something is known to be a trustworthy piece of software, because that's only one small component of the entire chain, right? The data and how you interpret data, and then what you do with the results, right? How you explain the model that's been built. There's lots of issues around that.
And
Um,
Nick, to your point, I mean that tech view that, it's all about the tech. It's also all about the user. How are we using it, and as well. And so there's multi dimensions, as you point out.
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. One from Raza, which is, you've got the score, which is great, and you mentioned that the score is really custom to each company, but with the ultimate intention to be to show how a company compares with other organizations. So how do you think of that, and then where are you on that journey?
Yeah, so we've talked to a few industries who have said that, whether it's healthcare and hospitals comparing, having common benchmarks, whether it's government departments, whether it's the banking industry. I mean, I do think that having some common measures. So we might, break that measuring stick into a common set of measures and then some organization or use case specific measures, so that you can compare and benchmark and see how we're doing relative to your industry. So I do expect that this is going to mature, this topic, as we go forward, because again, many industries are looking to have, some build trust around what they're doing, and again, getting the opportunity out of the AI but making sure that we are asking those questions that are relevant to our stakeholders. So I think that that's happening right now with the clients we're talking to about, saying, okay, let's have some common measures as opposed to our own.
Yeah. We got another question from Nicole. She asks, how do you define a black box versus a white box? And then if you're working with a third-party piece of AI software, how do you know, right? How do you know that the model they've built that you're now relying upon is in fact, a white box versus a black box? Do you audit them? Like how do you get to the color of the box?
Yeah. There's a few thoughts that come up with that question. First of all, we could say that we need transparency always, but that may be not really the case. I mean, as we know, there's many organizations that have IP and as you know, also depending on the type of AI, they may not be explainable. The deep neural net kind of technology, may build high performance, but become something that is a black box even for the PhDs and all. So the level of transparency is a question. And what we've learned is that we need to have measuring sticks for black boxes or white boxes. However, we can encourage our developers and our vendors to have a certain amount of transparency. What tests did they follow? What standards did they meet? And show some evidence as well. So that's where we get into the gray box. They may still have protected IP and models, but have some third-party testing or measures as well. So we have seen the spectrum. And again, as a board member, you're going to need to govern the black boxes as well as white boxes because, OpenAI and ChatGPT really is a black box to me as far as, what training data was used and when and how and where, we don't know for sure in many cases.
Yeah, I remember Nick teaching us about ChatGPT and some of its unintended biases that if you type in, show me a picture of 10 doctors, you get 10 men. Show me a picture of 10 nurses, you get 10 women. So there's a lot of stuff embedded in the other one I remember was Steve Wozniak going into the Apple Card and checking his credit score, and then his wife doing the same, and they were differential scores, even though they banked and had every institution the same. So again, there was sort of an unknown cognitive bias in there with respect to creditworthiness and gender. So there's a lot of stuff you don't really know, Nick, in a lot of these programs. And even maybe even the creators of them don't know either, right?
Yeah, I mean, like even when you purposefully try to tell an AI not to do something. So there's a very famous case of Amazon built an AI system to screen resumes for engineers, and they had told it to absolutely not look at the gender of the applicants. And you can infer, by the way, gender often from just a name, right? So even if the gender is not on the application, an AI can deduce it with very high accuracy. So it was like, hey, like do not differentiate from men and women. But the way the algorithm had been trained, and then by humans to say, hey, look, this is a good resume, this is not as good, had implicitly introduced gender bias. So yeah, even when you tell an AI not to do something, it doesn't mean it won't do it. Which
Yeah, right.
yeah.
The other one I love, Nick, is that when you ask them the same question that's a second time, it gives you a different answer.
Yeah,
So
that's right. If
I
I
don't
could
know.
come in on that, I mean, I think there is both the performance, like you said, you get a different answer each time, but the bias one is one that obviously fascinates many of us because we could exacerbate biases and make the world a worse place by
Yeah,
using historical data that is biased as we train our models going forward. But the good news, if I am an optimist, is that humans are biased. We all are. That's just our nature.
right.
But machines are biased as well. But the advantage on machines is that we can measure the bias. So we actually, with humans, we
Yeah.
can say, oh, it's not me, it's the other person over there that's got the bias. But how do you really know? But with machines, you can measure the training data, the operational data, the
Mhm.
performance, and all. So there are tools and metrics, and we've got an inventory of them and apply many of those metrics and measurements so that we can measure the bias. We actually can allow us to be less biased in our resume review and other examples as you shared. So, that's a really interesting question that, again, is a short-term one that we can ask right away on the biases in our AI activity and test and monitor it.
Yeah, and Niraj, as a follow-up, this is a great question from Michelle. Can a model card help with getting a transparency for the governance of use case and the models used for that use case? So for people who don't know, a model card is, kind of additional data about how models behave that's attached to a model. So is that a good way, Niraj, to get at, a little more transparency for these models?
Absolutely. And yeah, that gets back to a question that was asked earlier. I may not have fully answered. If you're in procurement and you're working with vendors, you can set the procurement expectations of your vendor community. And so model cards is a good example of, maybe a minimum requirement in certain use cases that we do have that data and we use that data to build trust as well. So yeah, I think, and I often work with public sector organizations who think that the private sector, doesn't want to share anything. Most private sector organizations want to build trust as well. I think all, or most certainly. And so knowing, that, okay, we want to set some test measures and elements to make you confident to buy, is something that can be done. But again, asking good questions is part of that process is what do we want to ask of our vendors? And the model cards is a good example of something that may be a requirement.
And Niraj, like again, working with third parties, right? Is there another way as well to protect one's company as a board member, which is the legal route, right? So if you're partnering with company XYZ to develop a model that does, ABC, can you in a contract say, no, you absolutely will not use this type of data. You will not, add this to the model. You won't behave this way. How much, in the quicksand of, of rapidly changing AI law today, how much that kind of legal protection could help a company, or do we not know at this point because there's not a lot of cases that have happened?
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's some lawyers on the call that probably can answer it better than I, but I think, your contractual law is a layer, of course, over and above, what the legislation requires and your terms of engagement. And I would come back to, having ongoing checks and balances rather than a one-time decision. So I believe you could, Nick, to your question, have expectations that are contractual to meet obligations.
Yeah. One of the key themes of your talk, which I really enjoy, by the way, thank you so much for doing that, is, what can't be measured, can't be managed. And you've got this platform that you've built to measure things better. Knowing that every company is different and every industry is different, what are some of the best practices for the kind of KPIs that a board should see around AI use cases?
Yeah, I'd say that, when we started New Energy, by the way, people thought AI governance is such a tiny market. Why would people care? And obviously, the world has changed. And one of the things that's changed is that there are hundreds of frameworks around the world, talking about ethics and biases and all of these requirements, but they tend to be at the macro level. And we encourage to get to the micro level. Let's get specific. And the way we encourage our clients to get specific is look through the eyes of your stakeholder. And if your stakeholder is, your customers or other stakeholders, depending on the use case, from their point of view, what questions would they ask? And then let's ask those questions early and measure and monitor. And you'll be surprised of how many of those questions can have a technical assessment, and we can actually get some real data, test data on those questions, and then we can again create a dashboard or a monitoring of that data. And then some of those questions are more qualitative, transparency, have you disclosed, kind of questions that we could have a third party reviewer create a metric. But my best practice view would be ask the questions in the eyes of the stakeholder, for your use of AI, and then look for measurements to answer it.
Right. We've got another question from Vitor. How do you see the potential for open source AI models to address privacy concerns that we're currently experiencing when we send our data to a large language model? For example, customized small language models that we can run locally on our machines. So for those of you who don't understand the technical question here, like when you send information to ChatGPT, that information is kept by ChatGPT. So, if you put your next earnings report into ChatGPT and ask it to improve it, your earnings report is not public, right? And somebody can find it. But if you have this model, into your local machines, that's not the case. So, any thoughts on that important question?
Yeah, Nick, I think you've probably got some good answers to that question yourself. But the opportunity to build on top of ChatGPT and localize the work is possible, as you know, in many applications. And there's some terrific applications built on top of large language models that do allow you to put some firewalls and localize it so that you can do that. Now, of course, you might have some limitations on what you can do based on the amount of data you have access to. But yeah, that's a terrific question, and again, may be required in many cases that we localize it and create some firewalls on where the data is going, but still getting the benefit of the technology.
Yeah, no, 11% of what employees put into ChatGPT is confidential information today. So you mentioned obviously, making sure that companies adhere to the law, which is changing rapidly. So that's difficult enough, right? But you also mentioned having the right policies, having the right questions, having the right data. So this pyramid that you built, I really like that slide a lot, right? Can you
Mhm.
just a little more about that? So if you were going to build a pyramid for a new company as a board member, like how do you've got the lawyers working on one layer, you've got, so how practically would you build this complex set of standards, policies, and processes here? And what would you start with? What would you be worried about? Like, what have you found when you do this? Like, what are the roadblocks? What are the issues? Or what gets in
Yeah.
the way?
Yes, we have a methodology at New Energy where we walk our clients through that building of that initial framework. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we ask the question of, okay, who are the stakeholders that we're looking to make sure those fears are addressed or questions are addressed, and then we look at identifying the categories that matter. So privacy. If you're a healthcare or you're organization, this may be the most important category, or in other organizations it may not matter. So the categories of trust need to be chosen, and then the questions need to be chosen. And so we do look at compliance as one of the categories. You clearly have to comply. What do you have to comply with? Depends on your industry and your location and your geography. So compliance, again, we see as foundational. We need to comply. That's just a given. But we don't believe that's enough in this legislative checkerboard. So asking the questions, identifying the questions, and then recognizing again that it will vary in those different dimensions. So we actually create that document and create that inventory of questions and metrics and apply them. And as mentioned earlier, guardrails won't guarantee you'll never have an accident, but it's your fiduciary responsibility to have guardrails. And so let's build the guardrails and evolve them as we go along. But you got to start somewhere.
I
Let's
wonder
talk
if
about that a little bit. It's like, in cyber, obviously, right? The companies have put guardrails for a long time, but when they're doing phishing tests internally, still, very, very high non-compliance rates. So how do you, assuming you've built this wonderful pyramid and you're now hopefully in a better position in terms of compliance with the government, compliance with legal authorities, and so on. But how do you how do you make sure your staff is highly compliant going forward as well?
Your staff is that yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, so one of the things we found, as I mentioned earlier, is policy. So there's frameworks about the measurements, like this pyramid is talking about, but then there's policy that you need to communicate, because many staff members are saying, I wonder if I'm allowed to do this, or I think I should, or should I disclose it or not, or should I just stay away from it because I'll get in trouble. And so we, as David said earlier about the tsunami and the extinction event, you want your staff to engage within what's acceptable to your organization. So you need to clarify that policy. And so we believe that by being clear on the policy and then having users educated and monitored as far as their usage, that way we can encourage the use, but still have guardrails on the use as well. So it's a moving target, Nick. I don't mean to oversimplify it at all, but the policy goes hand in hand with the framework.
Yeah, Nick, it's interesting. We looked at the creation of committees with respect to committees of boards with respect to technology. And not that many boards have put a committee in place, but I just wondered, it's an interesting question for a board to ask of itself. Should we set up a committee of the board called, compliance with Gen AI? or Gen AI compliance and oversight, like a subdivision of a risk committee or a new risk committee. I don't know. And then charge them, because that subcommittee could then hire on its own external experts and, increase its capability. But then at least there's somebody monitoring at the very top, which is what you need to do in governance. Be interesting to see who would be the first company on the S&P 500 or the Canadian 100 to do that. Are you aware of any, Nick? You're on 5 boards now.
Not that I've seen, no, but I think it's a good idea, and it's a good question, especially for companies who are heavily investing in AI, right? If you're, and especially the ones who are taking those, high impact or high risk use cases and starting to deploy them. I think at the very least, right? I mean, clearly the whole board should see all this stuff, but I think, if even if you don't create a new committee, whether the governance or the risk committee, should get, very frequent briefings on all the high risk use cases that are going on, right? And then check the boxes, right? Have we done the red teaming? Have we done this? Have we done that? I mean, the high risk use cases like that, the processes you have to follow in different jurisdictions are very detailed, very complex, and one of the key things you've got to do is actually kind of uh, prove that you've gone through a certain set of processes, right? So yeah, I don't think it's appropriate at the whole board at this point. If you're doing some high impact use cases, I do think a subset of the board has to look at it in detail.
Yeah. Yeah. My view on subcommittees has always been that's where you build the expertise in. And I use the board for broader conversations. So in the case of the audit committee, I'd say, you got 5 minutes, Nick, to report to the board. And you'll say, what, 5 minutes, David? Geez, I got a whole bunch of stuff. I said, well, we don't need to know a whole bunch of stuff. If we did, I'd send everybody to the audit committee. Anybody who wants to know more as an independent director, go to the audit committee. Nick loves to have you there. But you've got 5 minutes to talk to the board, because I'm not going to A, redo your work, and B, we have other things to talk about as a board that you hopefully will be a part of. But yeah, so I've always been an advocate of committees as a way of getting deeper expertise embedded into the board's due diligence oversight, as opposed to just letting it float on top. 75 more questions, 3 hours more meetings. Yeah, specialize.
David, would one of the techniques to get going be just getting it on your risk register so that you can action it?
Sure, you should be able to go to the risk committee today and say, this thing is here and our people are using it, and somebody's got to get on top of it. So maybe you have special meetings as a risk committee, and maybe you, Mr. Chair of the Risk Management Committee, come back to me, the chair of the board, and suggest whether we need a separate committee, because I'm all tied up myself in money laundering commitment. I think if you're on the bank of the TD Bank board now, you'd be worried about nothing else but money laundering and who are you hiring to overcome that problem?
And Michelle,
I think that's probably a good idea, Niraj. Start with the risk committee that you have. Ask that committee to consider this category of risk and how best we as a board should regard the way we go forward. What are our duties of care? So, yeah, good approach.
The risk register, and then the strategy, of course, is it embedded in the strategy or not?
Yeah.
And so you'd want it, that gets back to that halo and devil here. So you need to be doing both, would you agree?
Yeah.
Michelle just put in the chat that she works for an organization she's at an organization that's identified an AI lead, invested in AI governance educations, putting a responsible AI committee that helps oversee the acceptable use of AI, which is just fantastic. The Canadian Mental Health Association Toronto branch. Well, and then Michelle, do they have the board committee on AI as well?
This is all being done through the chat.
Yeah, yeah, Michelle's responding. Yeah. Well, look, I think we're almost at time. Niraj, thank you so much. I know Quinn, you probably wants to close, but I just wanted to extend my thanks to Niraj. I learned a lot. I thought that was super, super helpful in this complex field. So Michelle says there'll be board representatives on the committee, and the board owns the risk oversight and policy. Well, sounds, Michelle, like you're ahead of this curve and you're doing some really amazing things. So congratulations. So just thank you, Niraj, for my part. I really, really appreciate your time. And then kick it off to Quinn.
Well, I'd like to kick in as well. I think what we have seen, Nick and I, when we've talked to boards and senior executive C-suite teams, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety, which equals fear. Like, I can't get at this. Plus the fact it's your IT department has absolutely gone bonkers over cybersecurity. So there's kind of an okay, fine, this is going to transform the world, but we can't do anything because. And I think that New Energy has the answer to that because get over the fear so that you can get on with the value creation that's possible with AI. So I think you're a God from the heavens, Niraj, that have come to save us. And I'm very grateful to that you've invested this hour with us. So Quinn, you?
Thank you very
Thanks a
much.
lot, Niraj. This was our 8th episode. Niraj, how can people get in touch with you and engage with you?
Yeah, my email's here, and we'd be happy to follow up. I mean, we do believe that those fears are real, but AI can be trusted, and we'd be ready to work with a board or an organization. So my email is here, and I'm happy to take follow-ups. We can do a demo of the software and talk about how
That'd be
we're
great.
working
Yeah.
with boards and others.
Super.
Excellent. I'll double click on that too and just say that Niraj has shared his call to action. So if you're interested in generating a policy or creating a customized education program or creating an inventory of how AI is in your organization, those are practical ways to get started. As David said, get off your seat and start moving.
Yeah, and just say as a matter of risk oversight that neither Nick or I are shareholders in New Energy, nor receive any compensation from New Energy in any way, shape, or form. So we are completely third-party independent. Thanks, Quinn.
Yeah, and this is the 8th episode of AI Tsunami. We've been doing it since January. We are taking a break in August, but coming up in September, we'll be having Corey Jansen with a soft circle date of September 19th. Invites will be coming out shortly after the recording. I'm sure all of you have been following along this year. Really appreciate it. And outside of that, in September, we're going to be running an event that we ran last year with David. It's his Board Compass event. So this is outside of AI. It's a paid event, but it basically is a crash course on how to maintain and be a value-added director. So it goes through David's principles and best practices, and we'll be following up with you on that, all of you fellow directors. So thanks a lot. Thank you, David. Thanks, Nicholas, and looking forward to the fall.